This is a very special gathering of reporters remembering the John F. Kennedy assassination 50 years ago, and the Press Club of Dallas welcomes you. My name is Tony Peterson. I'm president of the Press Club. I also chair journalism at Southern Methodist University, and it's a great honor for me to be president at this particular time of the Press Club. Before I go any further, I want to recognize, and I want everybody here to put your hands together for a very dear friend of mine who is the chair of this event, past president of the Press Club, Liz Oliphant. Liz, take a bow. Wow. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce to you the moderator for this evening's event. Darwin Payne is Professor Emeritus of Journalism at Southern Methodist University. He was a working print journalist for the Dallas Times-Herald on the day of the assassination 50 years ago. In the years since, he has become a noted journalist, historian, and professor of journalism, and also is centennial historian of Southern Methodist University at this time. Please welcome Darwin Payne.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody. We're thrilled to see you all here for this, I think, a spectacular event. We haven't had this many reporters who covered the assassination together since the, started say 1963, but actually we didn't have them together then, but we had them together for the 30th at a pretty big event, but we've never had this many together again. I think this probably one of the key events of this 50th celebration. I mean, most unusual event to have this many people here. It's great for us, by the way, to see one another, too. So we're having great fun doing that. Every one of our participants tonight will tell what it was like to be there at a specific moment. And each will talk maybe 3 minutes or so. And if they wanted to, but they're not permitted to, they could talk for an hour or so telling about their exploits of that entire weekend, because the stories are so many and so interesting. But we want to try to finish in an appropriate amount of time tonight. I would like to, several reporters who were covering that, newsmen, journalists, are not up here on the panel. I'd like to mention Bert Holmes, longtime editor at the Dallas Times-Herald, who was soon the executive editor for many years at the Times-Herald. It's great to see Bert. Kent Biffle, with whom I worked at the Fort Worth Press, and then I came to the Times-Herald. He came to the Dallas Morning News, and Kent is here, a key reporter in this entire event, who was inside the school book depository just after the assassination. Johnny Weeks, who was on the editorial page of the Dallas Times-Herald. Johnny's out there somewhere. At least you ought to raise your hand, Johnny. There he is. And Kent, you didn't raise your hand. He lifted his glass. Okay. Well, also, don't forget we have a couple of books on sale. Bert Shipp's book, Details at 10, all about his antics as a reporter for WFAA-TV. And then we have Hugh Aynesworth's Witness to History. And you can see him back there. This would be a good opportunity to get signatures on those books. Now, the press, as we know, was really on its toes for the presidential visit. It was rare for a president to come to Dallas. Our anticipation, of course, was heightened by the volatile political atmosphere existing in the city. Some of our prominent citizens and officials had even urged the president to stay away from Dallas because they weren't certain what might happen to him. Only a month before, as you may recall, some of you, a mob of extremists had sort of attacked Adlai Stevenson at UN Day. And so because of the great fear that our city might be embarrassed by some such event as that, our very prominent Bloom advertising agency was delegated to ensure that the president and Jackie, the entire party, would be given a very enthusiastic reception. Heading that effort was our first speaker, Helen Holmes, then Helen Hankins, but for the last 49 years, Helen Holmes, wife of Bert Holmes, who's here tonight. So we're going to hear first from Helen.
Dallas knew it had a bad image, and so it was not surprising that the city fathers wanted a very successful presidential visit. And they also wanted to prepare Dallas for all the media scrutiny that was going to be on them, not just that day, but in the weeks ahead of time. And so it was no surprise that they picked Sam Bloom because of all his civic endeavors he'd had. I was Director of Public Relations for the Bloom Advertising Agency in 1963, and in very short order, we helped the city desegregate the lunch counters and open up the parks and swimming pools to minorities. We worked with DISD for the desegregation of all public schools, and it was considered one of the most peaceful desegregations in the country. We had about 3 weeks to work on this. My first planning memo that I found was November 4th. And we had the usual media duties of press releases and badges and all of that sort of thing. But we also had to work with the White House and the Secret Service on 3 important events. We had to work with the arrival at Love Field and for the motorcade and then for the site selection. And then we had to work with the hosts of the event, and that was the Dallas Citizens Council and then the Assembly and the Science Research Center. And so with all of those, we followed through all those duties. But I think the most important thing, or the one that was the most successful, was what we call the civic responsibility strategy. And I had it in one of my very first memos, and Sam Bloom approved it, and it was to sort of convince Dallas citizens to put aside all of their political thoughts and welcome the president of their country. And so we had ministers, we had the political parties, heads here in Dallas, and then we had businessmen, we had the arts represented. And I really thought it was, if we had all those people, it would be easier to convince people if they were, these respected people in different fields were going to issue their personal statements. And they did. And the Dallas Times-Herald and Morning News both ran short series of these. And then some of them appeared on TV and some were on radio interviews. And so we did all of these things, but there was controversy on every aspect of the visit. And in the first place, the site. The Secret Service did not like the trademark because of the balconies, and they were worried about snipers. And so I can remember going to the Women's Building in Fair Park with the Secret Service as a possible site, but finally the trademark was okayed. And then the date, in that November 4th memo, the date was the 20th, and then it changed to the 21st and then to the 22nd. And then on the motorcade, on November 15th, a White House spokesman said that it was unlikely, he was very doubtful that there would be a motorcade because of security concerns. And then 4 days later, a White House aide telephoned me with the route. And so that we had that. And then there was a controversy about the route itself. And the first time I was asked about it, there were some last minute changes, but the first time I was asked about it was 30 years after it happened. So this is the best that I could come up with, is that it had to do with the map. I think we were always going to go down Main Street, but I think the map showed us getting onto Stemmons. And you can't do that from Maine. You have to make the jog at Houston and then go down Elm in front of the school book depository. There was a lot about the number of people who could come. First time it was 1,800, then it was changed to 2,500 so that they could accommodate more people. And then there were lots and lots of meetings on the, with Secret Service and everybody else about whether it would be a formal ceremony at Love Field or whether it would be an official greeting, and the official greeting won. And then, of course, we had to deal with a lot of media who had requests and they had demands, especially from the foreign press. And I know that one French a journalist, was so outraged that I wouldn't give him credentials for Love Field that he spit at me, and he had to be escorted out of the building. But that was sort of a foreshadowing of things that we were going to face a little later on.
Now, don't go far, Helen. Helen also has the next segment because she was present, of course, at Love Field when the presidential party arrived, and she also joined the motorcade for the trip through town. So, Helen, you're back on stage.
Okay, at the civic and political leaders were at Love Field to welcome the president and the presidential party. And Eric Johnson, I think a group of people met at Eric Johnson's house. Say again?
A little bit.
Okay, a group of people, you want me to turn that? A group of people had met at Eric Johnson's house, and then they arrived at Love Field in a string of limousines. And so Mayor Earl Cabell was right there to greet the president and his wife as they came down those very steep steps. And Mrs. Cabell handed Jackie that beautiful bouquet of red roses. And Jackie was wearing that famous pink suit, of course, and the pillbox hat was just sort of, I thought it was defying gravity on the back of her head. But at any rate, they were very smiling, and everybody was happy. I saw behind the chain link fence, there was a big crowd of people that were cheering the president and his wife, and I felt pretty good about that. I thought maybe this is really going to work, and then I found out that the president was not going to have that protective plexiglass bubble over the convertible, and I started worrying again, because I thought that somebody might throw something at the president or at the president's car, and then that would be the headline. That would be all that they would talk about, no matter what other good things had happened. So I was a little worried there. But the president didn't seem to be worried about security at all. He walked over to the, and along with his wife, over to the chain link fence, and they started shaking hands. And we had been told that they might wave at everybody, but instead of that, they just waded right into it, shaking hands and smiling, and they looked like they were really enjoying it. And they went back, of course, to get into the lineup for the parade, the motorcade. And we had the responsibility for a pool car of reporters, and then another pool car for the photographers and cameramen that were there. And we also were responsible for the 2 buses for the White House press. Bob Haberlin, who was the assistant PR director, he got in one bus and I got in the other one. And I was delighted as we moved along. We saw the people cheering the president along the side. There were people lined up everywhere, and the crowds got bigger as closer we got to downtown. And then finally, when we got on Main Street, they were 20 deep and plus 20 deep, because I counted. And I saw only 2 signs that were negative. I was doing some talking, of course, but there were only 2 signs. And I think the White House press was looking for a lot of negative stuff, but they just didn't see very much. And so I said to everybody that was around there, now you're seeing the real Dallas. This is the real Dallas. And so we drove on, and I was feeling good about the whole thing. We got to, just before we got to the turn of Houston, we heard the shots, and I heard 3. And of course, we weren't sure what it was, but the White House CBS journalist who was sitting next to me, he said, "What was that?" And then he said, "We'll never know." And he said it kind of ruefully, like, "You'll know, they'll never tell us." And so we went to the bus stopped, and then the bus started up again. And as we made that turn, we saw the president's car just really barreling away. And so when somebody got off, I'm not sure exactly who it was, probably Robert McNeil, but anyway, he got off. And then other people wanted to get off, and they wouldn't let them. and I think there was a White House press aide on there directing the driver, but they slammed the door shut and whirled in front of the school book depository. And we saw all the signs that a lot of you have seen and all the pictures that they've had of it since. I saw the woman lying over her child and a man protecting someone. A lot of people were lying down on the grass. A lot of people were screaming and running. And so we passed all of that, and as we went under the triple underpass, I saw an officer abandon his motorcycle, and he was scrambling up the embankment. It was very steep, and he had a gun in his right hand, and he was having a hard time because he was sliding down a little bit. I saw that, and I thought then, I'm not into conspiracy theories, but I thought then that the shots had come from the railroad tracks. And anyway, a lot of the reporters started standing up in the buses and yelling, "Follow the president's car, follow the president's car," but the driver didn't, and pulled into the back of the trademark. And then we came in, started stampeding through there, past all the people with half-eaten steaks and little Six Flags centerpieces, but they were racing, and we all raced back to the press room that we'd set up on the first floor with all the phones. And so I'll let Vivian pick it up from there.
Thank you. Now, perhaps we should hold our applause until we all finish, and we'll save a lot of time, I think. Now, yes, there was a large crowd at the Trade Mart. There were about 2,400 Texas steak meals ready to eat. Vivian Castleberry, women's editor of the Dallas Times-Herald, was there. One of the things she did was to interview Judge Sarah T. Hughes, and later we'll hear about her second interview with Judge Hughes. Vivian.
Mine was press badge number 18, and my role for the weekend was to meet Jackie Kennedy at the Dallas Trade Mart and follow her through the weekend to the ranch. That morning early, I had got up before daylight, and I had taken with me to work our 14-year-old daughter, who absolutely was adamant that she must see the president. And before dawn that morning, I stationed her in front of what was then A. Harris on Elm Street, sitting on her books with the instructions that as soon as the motorcade passes, you walk across the street and you take the bus back to junior high school. I went to the Trade Mart early. In retrospect, I cannot imagine how free I was. I was probably one of the first people there. Nobody interrupted me. I got names of the head table. I got all of the decor, the stuff that women do, you know, so that I could put all the local color into my stories. And then it got later and later, and Judge Hughes was one of the last guests to arrive. And I jumped up from where I was and went over and asked her, "What do you think about the day?" And she said, and I looked up tonight to be sure I was getting this correct. Her words were, "I am very apprehensive, but this is a great day for Dallas, and I will be glad when it's over and he is out of town." So then we sat and we waited and we waited. And as Helen said, there were places on 3 levels for 2,400 diners, and everybody was restless, waiting and waiting. And suddenly behind me, behind the press table, those doors opened up, and the first person I saw enter the building was Helen Holmes. And one look at her face, and I could tell you that something was wrong. I stayed in my seat until I saw Bob Hollingsworth, who then was our bureau chief for the Times-Herald in Washington. And I jumped up and followed him to the phone. And for the next hour and a half, he and I together kept the phone open, feeding tidbits of information back to our paper. Bob finally left to go to the swearing-in at Love Field, and then I wandered again through the building to be sure I hadn't missed anything. If I had time, I would tell you all about that, but you don't need those details. The day then followed. People left. So far as I know, not a bite was taken out of any of those steaks, because I don't think that any of us would have picked up a fork until the head table was seated. But the waiters came around and started picking them up. So 2,400 Texas steaks bit the dust that day. Finally, back at the paper, I checked up to be sure that my daughter had got home okay as scheduled, and learned that she had, so I went about my professional business. I wish I had time to tell you about the rest of the day. I will give you just a tad about the press from all over the state, all over the nation, were just deluging the city rooms of both the Dallas Times-Herald and the Dallas Morning News. You will hear more of those stories later. But we were told at the Times-Herald, you are their host. You will treat them nicely. So one of the hardest things I ever had to do was sit at my desk and hear some of the press read erroneous information about Dallas back to their papers. They had the location of the courthouse incorrect. They had the trademark incorrect. It was just awful to sit there and listen to them feed the information that I knew was wrong. But then the one story that I want to tell you, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my first cousin, whose name was Peggy Burney, and who was head of the shipping department for Jennifer Juniors, owned by Abraham Zapruder, called me on the phone. And the first words were, Vivian, I saw the president die today. And I said, Peggy, don't say another word until I get a piece of paper in the typewriter. So I typed her story. She was standing by Zapruder holding some of his film when he made that famous film. The day went on. Later in the afternoon, I had a wire from Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, asking me, what is Dallas like tonight? So after I had wrapped up everything that I could do for the Times-Herald, I put on my coat, I walked up Pacific Avenue to Harwood, down Harwood all the way to Commerce, down Commerce all the way to Field, and back to the paper, en route passing the Carousel Club, and not knowing at the time that the flowers that were hanging on the door would be significant in the later stories. So I wired then to Canada the story that began, Dallas is a ghost town tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to the next person.
Now, another newsman from the Times-Herald, no, Vivian wasn't a man, another news person from the Times-Herald was John Sholkoff, who rushed to Dealey Plaza shortly after the shots were fired, and at one point had a decision to make.
I went to the Dealey Plaza a few minutes after the president's shot and immediately started to interview the people that were standing within a few feet of the car as it passed by and the shots were thing. And without exception, these people said, my name is so-and-so, I live at so-and-so, my phone number is this, call me if you have any questions. They were all very, very cooperative. And in those interviews, every one of them, without exception, told absolutely wild, crazy stories. They had seen Jackie Kennedy killed. They'd heard a dozen shots. They had seen the FBI firing in different directions. And so none of these people lied. None of these people were telling untruth, and they were available for further interviews. And it is my belief that that's where a lot of the conspiracy stuff started, because these people later, their testimony, it appeared in a lot of those early books that came out that claimed that it was, a terrible conspiracy and it was ridiculous. None of these people were lying. They were quick to say, you know, who they were and where they were, and you could talk to them. But they were so struck by the enormity of seeing a president of the United States killed right before their eyes. People said, I saw 3 people hit by bullets next to me, standing next to me. I heard 12 shots. Our United States Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was, you know, many, many cars and thousands of people by around him smoking, he went and testified to the Warren Commission that he smelled rifle smoke. Well, hell, he could have been a Labrador Retriever and he couldn't have smelled the rifle smoke. He was so far away from the action. But people were not lying. They were swept up by the emotion of the situation. And I think a lot of the conspiracy stuff, and that conspiracy nut stuff still exists. My son-in-law, by the way, Helen, is named Sam Bloom. Oh. And his grandfather was the Sam Bloom that Helen worked for. There's a blog on the TV thing that says Sam Bloom, his grandfather, was part of a Jewish cabal that set the route up so they would go by the school book depository and Oswald could shoot it. And you could get that on the internet today. And that's the kind of craziness that still exists. I was sent to Washington after the assassination. I spent a couple of years up there, covered the Warren Commission. And it is my 2-bit opinion that there has never been a creditable bit of evidence ever come forward in the last 50 years that has changed the story that the Warren Commission said that Oswald acted alone, Ruby acted alone, and so on. Thank you.
Now, along the motorcade route was KRLD radio reporter Bob Huffaker. Now, Bob very much regrets being unable to be here tonight, but he sent a report which I'd like to read in his behalf. It's pretty compelling, I think. 3 minutes. You check me on 3 minutes here. Quote, I tested the time. I broadcast the president's motorcade from the corner of Main and Eckerd, where vast crowds of cheering well-wishers had given JFK and his beautiful wife a warm welcome to Dallas. Ticker tape flowed from windows high above us. The gray and misty morning had given way to sunshine and blue skies on a spring-like autumn day. I had set starry-eyed children atop my KRLD radio mobile unit's luggage rack so that they could get a good view of the first couple. I was still reporting while Lee Harvey Oswald was killing President Kennedy barely more than 1,000 yards away. I could not hear the 3 shots that echoed through Dealey Plaza. A few minutes later, I was behind the wheel, speeding with my colleague Warren Fulks to Parkland Hospital, where I drove around the police barricades, jumped the wagon over the curb, and across medians to some 150 feet of Parkland's emergency entrance. There, among the crowd, standing quite vigil in the parking lot, I broadcast the saddest scene of my life. And this is what he said. What was a wonderful welcome in downtown Dallas has become a scene of indescribable horror as hundreds of people crowd outside the back door to the emergency room here at Parkland Hospital. Faces are ashen white, and people are wondering, is our president going to live? President Kennedy is on the inside of Parkland Hospital, and 2 priests have just been sent into the room with the president. And that's the end of his quote there. Dignitaries who had been in the motorcade milled about in shocked confusion, unable to go inside the hospital, and they stood in hushed conversations. I interviewed them as gently as I could. Senator Ralph Yarborough burst into tears at my first question. Congressman Ray Roberts was barely able to speak. Warren Fulks and I gave our KRLD listeners as much information as we could get, summarizing for them the stark facts, letting them know that we would stay on the air to keep them informed, updating them with each shred of information we could get. After a while, Congressman Jim Wright of Fort Worth agreed to come with me to my mobile unit so that I could interview him by way of its 2-way radio. The future House Speaker and I stood together in the silent crowd as my unit's radio told us that JFK was dead. I felt like weeping. I said on the radio, no one wants to say anything on an occasion like this, but someone must have something to say. We have with us Fort Worth Congressman Jim Wright. Mr. Wright, do you have something to say? I held the microphone as Jim Wright bowed his head, and this is what Jim Wright said. We have just learned that our president is dead. This is a sad day, a day of grief, a day of shame for this land that anyone would hate, that anyone would seek to kill the president of the United States. We must strive anew to rebuild our faith and our hope. May a merciful God console his loved ones and his family. May that same God bless this land, that from this moment of such deep grief we may rebuild in faith and not in fear, and love and not in hate. I know the nation mourns and will deeply mourn. Those of us who are with him today when he was so alive, so buoyant, so outgoing, exposing himself to the public, will never forget this experience and will always remember him as the president who went to the people, not fearing to expose himself, his person, his safety, his own repose to his land and his people. It is tragic that in this free land anyone would so learn to hate in his heart that he would seek to take violently into his hands this kind of act. But it has been done. There is still in this land the fiber to rebuild on a basis of respect for duly constituted authority. And we must do it, and we must not panic. Jim Wright's words haunt my memory a half-century later. Bob Hufker wrote, "The indelible grief will never leave me, nor will that moment of muted hope with the great-hearted congressman who later served our country as Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives." So I thought that was a pretty compelling statement. That afternoon, the Dallas Times-Herald had a particular problem. The president had arrived at almost precisely the hour of its deadline for its afternoon edition. The story was being put together by bits and pieces. Bill Sloan was on the desk next to editing copy, writing headlines as the story was put together. Bill?
Well, much of that afternoon was just a blur of shock and dismay in the newsroom, but there are two things I remember distinctly about November 22nd, 1963, and there are two things I'll never forget. One was a page proof of the front page of our three-star city edition, which was just about to go on the press at about 12:30 that afternoon. I was supposed to check that proof for errors and relay any corrections to the guys on the third floor. But I don't remember finding any errors, so I just let them know that they could start the presses. As it happened, I had written the main headline for that front page myself. It read something like, "Cheering crowds welcome Kennedy to Dallas." But of course, nobody outside the Times-Herald building ever had a chance to see it. And when I finished checking it, I tossed it into a wastebasket and didn't think any more about it. It wasn't more than a couple of minutes later when the second thing I remember happened. A rewrite man named Ben Stevens was sitting directly across the desk from me. He was on an open line to George Carter, our police reporter at City Hall. And Carter was hovering over the police radio dispatcher's shoulder, listening to calls coming in from across the city. All of a sudden, Ben came straight up out of his chair, whipped off his headset, and yelled, "Okay, this is it. Shots fired at the motorcade. It looks like Kennedy's been hit." In that instant, total pandemonium broke out all over the newsroom, closely followed by total paralysis. For about 10 or 12 minutes, everybody lapsed into shock, wringing their hands and mumbling, my God, how could this happen?" But then somehow, with the considerable help of our big boss, Felix McKnight, and our sports editor, Blackie Sherrod, we all managed to start functioning like journalists again. And I think we did as well as any news staff in the world could have done under the circumstances. Obviously, I never gave a thought for the rest of the afternoon to that page proof I'd thrown away. It was at least the next day and maybe several days later before it dawned on me what a historical artifact I had so casually discarded. Of course, the proof was gone forever, like a lot of other things that disappeared that day. But I still think about it sometimes. and I'll always wish that everyone in Dallas could have read that happy headline I'd written for the front page instead of the one we replaced it with, which said, "President dead, Connally shot." Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Now, the Dallas Morning News had problems of its own in covering this fast-breaking story. And in the newsroom, trying to coordinate the large staff of 25 or so reporters was Assistant City Editor Griff Singer.
That may sort of be an overstatement that I was trying to coordinate all 25. The fact is, it was sort of like herding cats because people were scattered all over creation. The main editors, the managing editor was on grand jury duty. Other editors were at the trademark, ready for the big extravaganza they were anticipating. And so by the time things started popping, we had people literally scattered all over. It was sort of like herding cats. And if we flip-flopped and think about how this story might have been covered today with all of the digital tools that we have, it would have been a heck of a lot different. But the reporters and the photographers, we had communication with our photographers. They all had cars with radios. Not a single reporter had any way except a payphone or stealing a phone from somebody to report in and keep up what was going on. By the same token, we had difficulty, and I'm sure the Times Herald had too, on trying to find out where all of our reporters were. We didn't have GPSs on to keep track, and that gives you a little bit of apprehension. But what you find out in a situation like this is that you can work with a group of people who are true professionals and have this sense of knowing where to go and what to do and how to keep you informed. And the Dallas News team, I felt like, really did a tremendous job that day. People were calling in with literally bits of information, and what few people were in the newsroom that weren't outside were typing up notes, sometimes a small strip of paper. That day we were still using flour paste and paper to put things together. We didn't even know what a computer was. And one of the big arguments, let me back up, and one of the big discussions was, will the Dallas News put out an extra? And hindsight being 20/20, it looks like the Dallas News management made a smart idea. Let's get the best, most complete paper out as early as we can, rather than doing an extra and then having to start all over again. And so that's exactly what happened. So people started calling in with information. And if you'll notice the front page of the Dallas News that following day, the main story has no byline. How many of you know who wrote that story? It was Paul Croom who wrote The Big D. We put Croom off into a small conference room by himself, and we methodically fed him information coming in from the reporters in the field, and that's how that main bar was put together. Was literally, it was an amalgamation of a lot of information from a lot of people. And, when all said and done, I thought it was an impressive job, and I was extremely proud to be a part of that team. But if you think about what would be available to us today, there was even a big argument about how to spell police officer J.D. Tippett's last name. You couldn't find it. Police officers had unlisted phone numbers. The police department was overwhelmed with other things, obviously, that day. And it took several hours to finally confirm how to spell his last name. Things like that happen. And so, like I say, it points up that we found out, and Vivian pointed out, we found out we had really damn good journalists working in Dallas, Texas in that day when you saw what some of the other people had done. And it makes you proud. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Griff. Now, when the shots were fired at Dealey Plaza, WFAA radio newsman Piers Allman was there, and he rushed into the school book depository. Pierce?
I decided at the last minute, I was a Republican, didn't vote for the guy, but I really admired him. I thought he was a new breed of politician. He understood the modern media, how to use them. I thought he was extraordinarily articulate, attractive. The wife was with him, closest thing to royalty. And I thought, right after the noon hour, I think I'm going to walk over and see the first couple. About 2 blocks in, a companion radio salesman, Terry Ford, had walked with me, and I kept looking up at the tall buildings and the open windows. And about halfway through Dealey Plaza, walking over from WFAA, I wondered how they secured all that. And I turned to Terry and said, you know, if there were going to be anything like an assassination attempt, this would probably be the place. I don't know why I said that. Walked on over and stood on the corner opposite the front door of the depository building. Motorcade came by. I was struck by the first couple so much that I hollered out something like, "Welcome to Dallas, Mr. President," and then the car turned, and you know the sequence of events. There's a split when something like that happens between the intellectual and the emotional. And in the whole 20-second span from the time that car turned till it left the triple underpass, and you have a 6.5 or 7 second sequence of shots and everything that transpired, intellectually, you see it, and you see what's happening, and you accept it, and your instincts are saying, this is happening. Emotionally, there's an air of unreality about the whole thing. This can't be happening in my hometown. This isn't taking place 4 blocks from where I work. It really is a split scenario. When the car finally sped off, I thought, I've got to get to a phone. There was no portable equipment in those days. If you remember, the transistor radio had just been invented. So I ran down a little ways, ran across the street, stopped at the young couple who were flat on the ground with the 2 kids. Bill was on the left. And I don't know why I stopped, but I said, "Are you okay?" And he rolled over and he said, "Yeah, but they got the president. They blew the side of his head in." And I won't try to go into detail about what I had seen on the other side of the street. But I thought, I've got to find the phone, and obviously the closest phone's going to be in the depository building, not thinking that's where the assassin and assassins are and maybe, are coming out. So I ran up the sidewalk, ran up the steps, ran into the door of the depository building, and there was a guy in the doorway. And I showed him my press card and said, "Where's a phone?" And he jerked his thumb and he said, "In there." I said, "Thank you," made eye contact and went on in. Got on the phone. This is within 2.5 to 3 minutes after the shooting. And called in, and I guess I told him I was in the depository building or something, but I said, "Just patch me through and leave the line open." And so we were the only ones there, and we did get the story out about the shooting as factually as I could. And then the lobby was chaotic. No one ever took charge. But I stayed on the phone and kept looking around, and a few minutes later, Luke Mooney brought down the 3 shell casings that they had found in a corner on the 6th floor. I got that on the air. And then a little bit later, Gene Boone had found, but it was Carl Day who brought down the rifle. And we got that on the air. So in that first phone session, we did establish that it was the 6th floor, the rifle, and the 3 shots. No one ever asked who I was or whom I was calling, until finally, a man came up and identified himself as Army Intelligence and asked who I was and suggested I, get off the phone. I tried to get out of the building, and it was cordoned off by police, but I finally broke through and ran back to the studio. And when I ran in, the first thing I asked was, "Is the president dead?" They said yes. And I did a brief video feed and then went up to the control room, and we were, as everybody, inundated by journalists from all over the world, and we're trying to feed all over the world. And by then it was get after the story. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What's he doing in Dallas? Why did he do it? Et cetera, et cetera. And I had just been married about a month. my good wife, Allie Beth, and evidently I called her at some time because I didn't get home for 3 days and 3 nights. But the follow-up was about 3 weeks later, and the Secret Service called and asked if they could come visit. I said, sure. And they showed up. They never recorded anything. He held his briefcase in front of him the whole time. And they wanted to talk about where I was standing and what the timing was, where I ran, how much time lapsed. When I went in the doorway, what did I say to the guy in the doorway? What did he say? What were my gestures? What were his gestures? And we went through this 4 or 5 times. And finally they said, are you familiar with the testimony of Lee Oswald after his arrest? I said, no. They said, well, he states that as he was leaving the depository building, a young man with a crew cut rushed up, identified himself as a newsman, and asked where a phone was. And they said, based on what you've said and based on what he said, this is obviously you. Can you give us any more identification? I said, no, I can't. It would be power of suggestion. I've seen the guy's photograph now. They said, well, take your time, just think about it. And I thought about it. And I said, I really can't tell you anything else. He was not in a hurry. He did not seem agitated. He wasn't breathless. But that's it. So they left. And I didn't run down the hall and tell anybody, and really didn't tell anyone. I just thought about it for a long time. And it's one of those things that sort of becomes part of your life. So, again, I haven't talked about it much, except my overwhelming impressions from that day and everything that followed was that it was, if you were there, and if you heard the shots, felt the shots, sensed where the shots came from, and everything that followed, it was one man, one gun, 3 shots.
Thank you, Chris. Well, as I said, I mean, they all have great stories. Now, another journalist who was there at Dealey Plaza, one who seemed to be everywhere that weekend and afterwards too, was Hugh Aynesworth of the Dallas Morning News. I saw Hugh only last night on Pierce Morgan on CNN. You look great, Hugh. Come on.
November 22nd, I was a reporter for the Dallas News, and I was a little pissed because I wasn't supposed to do anything on this whole visit of the president. Actually, I had the best beat, I thought, on the paper there, so I really couldn't complain too much. I covered the astronauts and the space program, and in the 60s, that was really fun and a big deal, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, but still, as everybody would come up and they'd say, I'm going to the Trade Mart, I'm in the motorcade, I'm going to Love Field. I got a little tired of hearing that, and also got a little tired of answering phones in that near empty office. So I decided to walk over and watch the president and Jackie. And I saw a couple of lawyers I knew. I tried to get through the crowd on Main Street, but like Helen said, they were 8 and 10 and 12 deep. Everywhere you'd look, and they were just so happy and so pleased, and it was exciting to me because we had this anticipation. We didn't think anything would happen like that did happen, but we really, a lot of us thought we were anticipatory, thinking that somebody would throw something, or there'd be a whole lot of picketers or people yelling at the president, because it really was sort of mean streets in Dallas at that time. Not totally. The people that were the people that were haters it's a very small number, but they were very vocal and they were very vociferous in their belief. But we anticipated there might be something happen. I walked over close to the depository building before I found a place that was only 2 or 3 deep, and had I looked up, I could have seen Oswald in the window at 1 o'clock. I didn't. Meantime, the radios, KLIF and KRLD primarily, were covering every bit of it, and people had their new transistor radios out, and everybody was excited. And I remember as they came down Main Street, people just went wild. They were just unbelievably wild with joy, with happiness. And it was a beautiful day. It started out overcast, and then suddenly, 10:30 or so, the sky opened up in this beautiful blue sky. And it was just a perfect day. And here came the motorcade, turned right there on Houston, came by me, and I'm probably 2 or 3 deep myself. But still, I could see them, and everyone was saying, "Oh, look at Jackie, look at Jackie." And they were having a good time. They were pleased at the reception, and the Connollys were so proud. I mean, you could just feel it. And I remember there was a very large woman behind me, and she said, "Oh, Jackie, she's wearing my dress." And she had the same color of strawberry pink that Jackie had, and it made her day briefly. After they passed, I heard what I thought was a motorcycle backfire. But it wasn't a motorcycle. That was the first shot. And then a second shot 2 or 3 seconds later, and then a third. And I'm not a shooter, but I could tell that the 2 shots that I listened very carefully for were rifle shots. And all of a sudden, the world just went wild. Chaos, it's like snapping your fingers. People started crying, people started screaming. I mean, within seconds. People were throwing the children on the ground, covering them. I would have probably run, but I didn't know which way to run. Because we didn't know who was shooting, we didn't know how many were shooting, and we didn't know where they were shooting from. All we knew that something was happening. And you know, at that time, we were in this Cold War with Russia, and we were scared to death of some kind of nuclear activity. And I'm sure this thought was in people's minds to begin with. And of course, as we learned later in the day that Oswald had been to Russia, was a defector back home, that's solid, that solidified rather. But right then, I didn't know what to do. And like I said, I should have run. I didn't know which way to go. So I thought, well, I saw a man in front of me right across Houston Street pointing up to that window, that 6th floor window. And I thought, well, I don't know what he's seen or what he knows, but I've got to find out. My problem was I didn't have a pencil or paper with me. For a reporter, that's damn tough, you know. I saw a little boy with one of these big jumbo pencils about this big, American flag on it, and he was waving it. He wasn't waving it long. I took it and gave him 2 quarters, and I still didn't have anything to write on. You know, his daddy's probably, he almost had a conniption fit because I don't know what he thought I was doing, but I quickly got out of there. I reached in my pocket, just don't know why, maybe to get a handkerchief or whatever, but I had 2 unmailed utility bills. So there was something to write on. And I ran to this man, and I asked him 2 or 3 questions, and God, he was excited. He said, "I saw him. Almost 2 minutes I saw him." And then he found out I was with the Dallas News, and he actually called 2 cops over here to get me away from him. Well, that was sort of a bonus for me, because had he let me, I would have moved him off to my side and away from the other press guys and had him. But that moved me more toward the depository building, where I interviewed more people and stayed close to a radio. As they've said, some of my cohorts here, you had to be around a radio at that time, police radio, or you didn't know what was going on and where. So I heard this call come in, said this is a citizen, an officer's been shot, gave the location. And then I made a decision. It was the luckiest thing. I thought, usually I made mistakes all weekend, but I said, look, if someone shoots at the president here, and we didn't know the president's condition at that time, if somebody shoots the president here, someone shoots an officer 3 or 4 miles away, there's a distinct possibility that they're connected in some way. So I had another problem. I wanted to get over there. I talked to Jim Yule, our police reporter. He said, well, we'll stay here because we thought whoever had been shooting was trapped up on top of the depository building. So I didn't have a way to get over there, so I found 2 Channel 8 reporters that had a mobile unit. And I told them what I'd heard, and they said, let's go. So we sped across the viaduct over to Oak Cliff to interview the people over there. We almost hit 2 or 3 people going who were screaming. We almost hit a cop who was constantly over the years reminded me of the fact. We got over there and we interviewed. There were a lot of witnesses that saw, no matter what you read in the conspiracy books, there were at least 6 people that had testimony about that. We saw 2 people that saw him shoot the cop. We saw 2 people that actually chased him from the scene a little bit. He was a little younger than they were. And we saw a couple of people that saw him eject shells into the street and into the bushes. So we knew what he looked like, but we still didn't know that was connected to the Kennedy thing. So I'll leave it there because later I find over to the theater, but I'll leave it there.
And has claimed to be being the first newsman to report Kennedy's death, but it wasn't easy for him. So Bert.
Oh, thank you. I'm like, get up here, enjoying these stories so much. Thank you. Well, I don't know where to start because they're all just about finished. And anyhow, I got hungry and I was over at the Trade Mart going to get me one of those pea and bean dinners. And but I stopped along the side of the building, the Trade Mart, to talk to a detective and who was shooting the bull. And at that time he said, something's happening. I said, what's happening? He said, something happened downtown. Somebody got hit. And I said, what, with a rock or a board or something? He said, no. He said, it sounds pretty serious. And about that time, we heard the sirens coming down the Stemmons. It was I-35. Went out there and took a picture of the limousine going by. And boy, he's not even going to turn in here to the Trade Mart. Knew we was going to have the big story or no story at all. And I said, what are you going to do? And he said, I don't know what to do. I don't have any orders. And I said, well, let's get to Parkland. We went about 130 miles an hour up to Parkland and jumped out of the car and started taking pictures. And everybody's faces looked the same. It looked like Night of the Living Dead. Everybody was just stunned and walking around in circles. And I talked to several people and tried to find out if they knew what was going on. And I got a hold of it. Couldn't find a darn phone. I don't know where Paris was, but I couldn't find a phone at all. And Merriman Smith told me that if I tried to take the phone away from him, he was going to show me where the daylight wasn't. And so I finally got a hold of the phone and called in, and you got to listen to this, you're not going to believe it. The guy on the radio, his name was Bob Thornton, said, I told him, I said, Bob, I've talked to a bunch of people, Allman, Decker, and all of them, and I said, I think that there's enough here that we can put it together. The president cannot live. And I said, I don't know if he's dead or not, but I know he can't live. So you put that together. And this Thornton said, well, the news director had told the news people in radio that not to put anything on the air unless they saw the death certificate. Well, there wasn't any death certificates to be shown around that newsroom. And we argued back and forth, and finally I heard a click, and that left me on the line with I don't know how many million people that were listening to WFA and NBC or whatever it was, but they I told them what I knew is that I hated to say it, but there's enough information here that indicates that the president is not going to make it. Still, I didn't say he's dead because I was as bad as the radio newsman. But anyhow, I got the word in that you got a lot of information. You got a whole bunch of information. A whole sheet of paper of it. And but it doesn't do you any good until you get somebody to listen to you. And I was hoping that somebody was listening to me, but I didn't know who it was because I didn't have a death certificate. That's where you're supposed to laugh. Huh? But anyhow, I'll just cut to the chase. We got out of the building, and my car was down at the Trade Mart, and the detective was gone, and there was the stoplight there, and the old DeSoto pulled up there, and and I thought, I wonder where he's going. I opened the door, and I said, I'm Bert Shippen with Channel 8 News. We got a story, and I needed to ride down to the station. He said, well, I'm not going that way. And I said, yeah, you are. I put my foot on the accelerator and got the radio going. I said, hey, you work the brake, and I'll work something else. And he said, oh, you were going to ruin my car. And I said, no, I'll buy you a new one. Anyhow, we got to go down the street, and I was listening to the radio and honking the horn, and it was a silly-looking sight, I imagine. But anyhow, we got down to the station, and I can imagine that in the evening his wife said, well, how was your day? He said it was probably 8 days long. But anyhow, we made it down to the station, and we got there in time to correct some mistakes that we made on the few mistakes. And I guess we could leave it right there because the good part comes up now.
Okay. Now we're going to go back to Hugh Aynesworth and the Texas Theater.
It says here that you're supposed to rest a little bit for this. We were back at the scene of the Tippett killing, and they got several reports that he was here and he was there. One was the public library, where a young boy ran into public library and said something about the president being shot, and about 5 people jumped him and rolled him to the ground, and all the police surrounded him and everything, and finally he said, but I work here. And he did. Then there was another place. It was an old furniture store, an old storage facility on Jefferson Avenue, and we got word that the suspect was in there. We didn't still connect him with the presidential shooting. We went in that store. I went in there with several people. I don't know whether it was 6 or 8 or 10, but a whole lot of cops. And 1 or 2 assistant district attorneys that I knew were there too. We go in, and this is a real decrepit, dirty old place. It's about to fall down. I don't know who would store any furniture in there, but all of a sudden somebody came in from the back, a police officer, and he fell through the floor and about up to here. And he went, oh! Well, everybody else went, oh, too. And I looked around, and everybody had a gun, except me. And I thought, that's when I got to get out of here, and I did. Fortunately, I went back to find a police radio. An FBI man was sitting in a car outside that house, that storage facility. And I heard then there's a suspect in the Texas Theater. Well, I'd seen too many guns and run too many miles, and I thought, but it's only 7 blocks or so to the theater, and I got to go. So I ran like the devil to there, and I ran. The first person I saw was Julia Postal, and she was the ticket salesman for the Texas Theater. She had a radio up to her here, and she was crying, and I think, though I'm not definitely sure, that's when she heard the president was dead, and she was very, very upset. And then I asked her the most stupid question I asked the whole weekend. I said, did he buy a ticket? And she looked at me with contempt, and she said, he's in there, he's in there. And so I ran in the theater. And in the Texas Theater, when you go in, why, it's a lobby here, but first door to your right goes into the seated area. And I did that, and I looked in, and immediately I saw the lights were going up about halfway. The movie was still playing, War is Hell. And I saw people coming off the stage up the aisles toward me. And there were 2 on one side, I think, and 3 on the other. A couple of them had police uniforms on, a couple of them didn't, but I knew that they were the cops and they were looking for somebody. There were only about 13 people in that theater that day. And over here to my, say, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 15 feet away was Oswald. Of course, I didn't know who they were looking for, and I don't think immediately they did either. They stopped some other people and they came up, and then they moved in. Officer Nick McDonald moved into that aisle, and he said, I did not hear this, but he said, Oswald said, well, it's all over now. But it wasn't, because Oswald pulled a pistol, tried to kill Officer McDonald. By that time, 2 or 3 people from this side, McDonald and another FBI agent from this side, jumped on him. And it was like a scrum. It was like a fist, a leg up here and an arm over there and a whole lot of cussing over here. And it was rapid, but it was mean. It was hard to believe it happened so fast. And they got him down in that seat. He pulled that gun, but he couldn't shoot the officer. He pulled that pistol out. And somebody got their hand in the firing mechanism, and so it didn't kill the other cop. But they got him out of there in a hurry. And the only thing I heard him say, he said it twice, he was screaming, I protest this police brutality. Well, they did rough him up a lot, but in the seats like that, I mean, he had a cut here, and a couple of the officers had a little wound here. One officer broke his ankle, as a matter of fact. They got him out of there, and I was amazed because it seemed to me that already outside there were hundreds of people, and they were shouting, kill that son of a, that SOB, excuse me, and let's have him, let us have him. And I didn't know, it sort of surprised me. I guess the radio had really done a good job, the radio station, because there were that many people out there.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you. Now, the body of President Kennedy was loaded that afternoon onto Air Force One, and Jimmy Darnell of WBAP TV was there to record that. Jimmy?
Hello, Mr. Cameraman, are both of my hairs combed? Okay, I was assigned to ride in the motorcade that day, and so I went out in my news unit and left it there and rode in the motorcade to downtown Dallas. And of course, the motorcade ended basically at the Texas Book Depository. And so I was there and shot tons of video there at the Texas Book Depository. And then later in the day, a cameraman, Floyd Bright, who came over from Fort Worth after the assassination to help us cover it, took me out in his news unit to get so I could pick up my news unit from Love Field. And it so happens that at the same time, the presidential entourage was there and they were loading up everyone. And I went up with my camera to about the second or third floor of the parking garage there at Love Field and took a bunch of what was great video or film of the people getting on the plane and all that. And then when I walked back down to go to my news unit, this police officer stopped me and confiscated my film. And he looked at me and said, that's sacrilegious. Well, Jimmy Kerr, my boss in Dallas at the time, spent the rest of his day primarily trying to recover my film rather than him covering aspects of the assassination story. But the film, I never got it back, and I considered it to be just a devastating experience. But then after years later, I got to thinking about it, and I thought about the police officers in Dallas and what incredible amount of stress and everything they must have gone through, being blamed by a lot of people for the president's being shot. And I thought, well, I'm going to forgive him, even though that was a terrible thing, and I've decided to do that. And God bless him. Thank you.
Well, we're running a little bit long, Tony. How are we doing? Okay, keep going. All right. Well, we weren't going to eliminate anybody, don't worry. Now, U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes was summoned to Air Force One to swear in Lyndon Johnson as President of the United States. Immediately afterwards, Vivian Castleberry of the Times-Herald contacted her and had the first interview with Judge Hughes.
Sarah Hughes was a woman of few words, and so am I. So I reached her when after she swore in the president, she drove home, and I reached her by telephone. She answered her own phone, and I said, "So, tell me, how was it?" By that time, I had interviewed Sarah Hughes countless times for many different reasons. And she said, "Well, Vivian, it was no big deal. Lyndon asked me to do it, and I was glad to do it. And I tried to probe her to get more details, and she shut up and didn't say another word. So I won't say another word."
Okay, thanks, Vivian. With Oswald's capture, the press descended on the police station that afternoon. Ike Pappas was a New York City radio reporter who came, and he was there at that infamous midnight press conference at which the police brought out Oswald for the press to see. And Ike is now deceased, but he had a fascinating account of that, which he gave at our last report, at the 30th anniversary of Reporters Remember. And I thought I would just read just quickly the interesting things that happened to him. First, the press was clamoring for to see Oswald. And finally, at about midnight, Jesse Carey, the police chief, and I think Will Fritz, homicide captain, agreed, okay, you can see him. And they agreed to bring him down to the police lineup room. Now, as Ike says, of course, the deal was that we were not going to ask any questions. Oh, no, no questions. Bring him down. We only want to look at him. Captain Fritz agreed to that, and Jesse Carey did too. No questions. Of course, as soon as he hit the door, everybody asked questions. The rules went out the window. Here he is, the most notorious prisoner in American history, and right in front of us. I'm going to ask this guy a question. And I screamed at him, just like everybody else. "Did you shoot the president?" And he didn't answer. "And how did you get hurt?" And other questions that are around the periphery. And then everybody said, "Let's ask the same question. Did you shoot the president?" And then he said, "No, that's what I'm accused of. I didn't shoot anybody." So, and then the rules had been broken with the questions. They whisked him away. But now, when the dust cleared, Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas County, was doing an interview, talking to reporters. I was desperate for a telephone. I ran out into a room outside of the lineup room, and there I saw some telephones. I'm dialing New York, and I say, "I've got to get Henry Wade on here. I'm going to do an interview with him. Stand by to record." So I'm yelling and looking around frantically like that, and up comes this little guy in a blue suit, pinstripe suit with gray fedora. And he says, "What's the matter?" And I say, "I'm looking for Henry Wade." He said, "What are you, a reporter?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Where are you from?" "New York." I said, "Are you a cop?" Because I thought he was a vice cop. That's Ike Pappas. I said, "Here's a detective. He's got an office. He's got a phone. I've got to humor this guy." So he says, "No, my name is Jack Ruby. I run the Carousel Club." I said, "Well, amazing." I said, "Jack Ruby, the Carousel Club. What is it?" He says, "Here, come on down." He gives me his card. And he says, "Get some of your guys down after this is over with, and come on down and have a beer." We have a lot of girls there, take care of you. So I played along, and I said, okay, I got your card right here, put it right here, right? Put it in his pocket. Now I got to have Henry Wade over here. Can you go get him? I got to watch the phone here. He said, just a minute. He goes running over to Henry Wade, taps him, says, Henry, mumble, mumble, guy from New York. Henry looks over and says, tell him I'll be right over there. And Ruby disappears, and Henry Wade walks over, and I do the interview. I'm absolutely flabbergasted by all this, but nevertheless, I continue. I did a great job on the interview. Everybody's congratulating me. Personal interview with Henry Wade. Now, let's see, where are we going? I think we're going to the burial of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, we didn't want him buried in Dallas, but a place in Fort Worth was located. Mike Cochran of the Associated Press was there. So Mike, come and tell us about how that happened.
Yeah. Following this group is tough, isn't it? I feel like Obama following Jack Benny. I mentioned Jack Benny because not too long ago, talking to a group, and my wife Sandra is here. We were talking at any rate, and they said, "Well, wait a minute. If you were covering the assassination 50 years ago, well, how old are you going to be on your next birthday?" And I said, like Jack Benny, I'll be 39. And one of them says, who the hell is Jack Benny? I knew I could tell it to this group, Everybody here knows Jack Benny. No, but Rose Hill, the Rose Hill Cemetery, is a beautiful cemetery on the southeastern edge of Fort Worth. And it was noted in 1963 that the graves of many of the World War I and II veterans were scattered over the 90-acre cemetery, including a major Horace Carswell. And Carswell was actually buried close to where Oswald was at Rose Hill. And of course, Carswell Air Force Base is named for Carswell, and that's where President Kennedy departed for his final fateful hop to Dallas. I mean, there's just things that just kind of hit you as 2 weeks ago, I was out at Rose Hill for a deal, and I discovered that next to the grave of Oswald, a person is buried there named Ruby. And I can only assure you that there's no connection to the Jack Ruby that we all know and love. But it seems like there's little stunning things that keep happening on this thing. And of course, it was a crazy day, November the 25th, 1963. There were no friends of Oswald. There were no mourners. Just probably about nearly 100 people, and they were all reporters and photographers, cops and federal agents and whatever. And even the minister who was supposed to deliver the final rites out there and everything, he didn't even show up. And at the last moment, they got a Fort Worth minister who consented to do the eulogy and whatever. And he did say, he says, "We are not here to judge, only to commit for burial Lee Harvey Oswald." And it was a gloomy gloomy afternoon. And there was a light chill, and it ruffled the single flooring offering on the casket, and that had been purchased by the family, we were told. And everything was just kind of I don't know, it's kind of spooky. They delivered, the police escort delivered the body, the casket out there at Rose Hill about 1:30, but it would be nearly 4 o'clock before the actual ceremony would begin. And during that time, a rumor surfaced that among the reporters, not the cops, among the reporters, that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald in that casket. And that if there even was there may not even be a body in that casket, but if there was, it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. And it really caused a stir. And so finally the police chief, Cato Hightower, and a couple of other officers went into this little chapel and opened the casket and came out and confirmed that at least it was Oswald that was being buried. And then the family, of course, Secret Service delivered the family, 5 members. It was the widow Marina, 22-year-old Russian, and her and Lee's 2 little children, and her Lee's mother, Marguerite, who I can only tell you kindly is goofy as hell. And then Oswald's brother, Robert. And it was so, it was, we realized earlier that there were no mourners. There was nobody to carry the casket. And so we were sitting there wondering how all this thing was going to unfold. And Jerry Flemings of an ace reporter at the Star-Telegram at that time, and a wonderful guy and everything. And at one point, he just shook his head and he turned to me and he said, Cochran, if we're going to write a story about the burial of Lee Harvey Oswald, we're going to have to bury that son of a bitch ourselves. And we did. No, because they did. They had to turn to the reporters to be pallbearers, and because I was with the Associated Press, at the time I was a Fort Worth correspondent, and they asked me to be a pallbearer, and I said not only no, but I said hell no. And a United Press International reporter named Preston McGraw, of course, who was my only competitor at the funeral, he stepped up and he said, I'll be a pallbearer. Well, I wasn't very smart and I wasn't very experienced, but I wasn't totally stupid. So I said, I changed my mind. I'll be a pallbearer. So that's how I became a very minor footnote, a historical footnote in this whole deal, and why I'm here tonight. And of course, following this group is something else. But it was something else. None of us, I don't think a single one of the reporters that were, and Eddie will probably elaborate much better than this in a moment on the Oswald funeral, but none of us really thought about it, exactly what we were doing or anything. It was just, you weren't thinking about historical things or anything like that. We just did it so we could write a story and whatever. But it was I'm trying to think. I mean, for instance, they moved a bunch of us back after the family had gotten there and got around the casket. And the Marina was heard to whisper at one point, my husband, my love I give you. And we were told that, and of course, I don't think any reporter was able to actually hear that themselves. And it was, I don't know, and finally at 4:25 p.m., November the 25th, they lowered the casket into the ground. And 4 of the most traumatic days that any of us could ever have imagined kind of came to a close. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike, very much. Now we're going to check you out and have Eddie Hughes also was a pallbearer that day for Lee Harvey Oswald. So Eddie, my old friend from the 49th Armored Division and a former Dallas Morning News, longtime Dallas Morning News reporter who came from New Mexico to be with us.
Thank you, Darwin. It sure is good to be with a lot of the old reprobates. And y'all still look good over here. I was new to Fort Worth, had moved over to Fort Worth to open up a news bureau for the Dallas News in September. And so that was one reason that I ended up covering President Kennedy's visit to Fort Worth that morning. And then, as it turned out, on that following Monday, we had heard the night before that Oswald was going to be buried in Rose Hill Cemetery, where the family had a plot. That's why he was buried at Rose Hill. We were there about 10 o'clock in the morning, and the gates were all closed, and there was no one there. And we hung around, and as more and more and more reporters showed up, thinking that was going to be the time that they were going to bury him. And as Mike said, it was a long time afterward. And I assume a good part of that time was trying to find a minister to give last rites. There were many, many, many pastors in Fort Worth that were asked. And it was basically the guy that was asking was the president of the Fort Worth Council of Churches. And when he finally couldn't find anyone, was retired, but he was the one that gave the last rites. And once he finally indicated that he was going to come, then I guess they invited the family to show up, and they brought the casket over to the cemetery. When they were unloading the casket from the hearse on the gurney to put it into the chapel that was on the high hill that overlooked the cemetery, John McConnell of the Star-Telegram was there with a lot of us and offered to help. And I barely remember catching hold of one of the handholds on the back part of the casket, and we loaded it the short distance between the hearse and the gurney that they wheeled into the chapel, which was under tight security. Shortly thereafter, I heard a news reporter saying, "How do we know it's Oswald? For all you know, it may be a casket full of sacks of potatoes." And so John McConnell, who had been was a longtime police reporter for the Star-Telegram, went to Chief Hightower because he said, "Do you know whether or not that indeed is Oswald in the casket?" And Chief Hightower kind of looked at him and said, "Well, I don't know, but I'm going to find out." And so he went into the chapel, and he came back out, and he said, "Boys, I can guarantee you that's Oswald. I don't know exactly if it was shown that it was Oswald, or they convinced that it was Oswald, but everybody's by that time decided that it was indeed Oswald in the casket." When they were ready to go down the hill, John McConnell and Jerry Flemings were
around trying to get more of the newsmen to take hold of a position on the casket. And I took hold of the back left, and a couple of other Star-Telegram reporters took some other positions, including Jerry Flemings and John McConnell. There were still some openings. And opposite, on the other side where I was a fellow that was a cameraman for Channel 4 in Dallas, but he was based in Fort Worth. And he was sort of a hot shot and a young guy. And so out of the clear blue, he tried to hand off his 16mm camera to his competitor, who was Fred Hatton, and he shot for Channel 8 based in Fort Worth. Well, Hatton wasn't going to have anything to do about that. And then this guy, his name was Perringer, Steve Perringer, said, you know, this is going to make history. And when he said that, all of a sudden, all of us that were around that casket just about had someone behind us ready to take over. And the one that took Steve Perringer's position was Preston McGraw of UPI. And that then led to Mike Cochran of AP on the other front end of the casket. So by that time, we had 6 newsmen and then 2 members of the funeral home. Well, as we began to make the descent down, that was going to be the hill going down to the graveside, I suddenly kept thinking about this thing going to make history, and I had my camera strung over my shoulder. I was not only a reporter, but I also was a photographer. And so I decided maybe it would be better, the Dallas News would be a lot happier, if I popped off of that casket and took a photograph. And so I did. Took a photograph as they left the chapel, and you can see the newsmen that were on the casket that took it down quite a ways, as a matter of fact, to where the burial site was. When we were crowding around the tent where the services were going to be held, the pastor suddenly showed up, and he had never, of course, met with the grieving family of Oswald, and so he tried to carry on a conversation with them, and that wasn't working because we were all pretty loud. Not local reporters, it was all the international and national reporters there, you understand. But it was not a very thoughtful scene at a burial ceremony. So the minister asked if there was some way that we could sort of back off so he could have time to visit with the family. And Chief Hightower asked us to all step back, and we stepped back quite a ways from it. Now, Mike told you about the tombstone that is close to where Oswald is buried. Well, I was backing up, and as I was backing up, I sort of stepped on and stumbled over a tombstone that was flat in the ground. And when I looked down, the name on that tombstone was Kennedy. While we were away from the tent where the burial was being held, the family did come up to the casket and gave, I guess, their last rites. And I don't ever remember that casket being open. But because if it was, we would have been back over there with our cameras running. I want to read you something that I wrote that day. I said, there, his lips sealed forever, Lee Harvey Oswald was buried 6 feet deep in the small family plot at the base of a barren hill at Rose Hill. And then I said, buried were Oswald's motives for the assassination of President Kennedy. Did you catch that? In my lead, I called him as alleged assassin. But way down in my story, I was the first person, long before the government, that declared he was the assassin of Lee Harvey Oswald. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eddie.
That's great. All right, thank you, Eddie. Now, my good friend Bob Compton, book editor of the Dallas Morning News, who was there during the duration of this and observing and helping on the rewrite desk and what have you. Bob?
Copy desk work on a newspaper is generally pretty routine, except on certain rare occasions, and November the 22nd was certainly a rare occasion. I was an assistant night city editor on the night of November the 21st, the day before Kennedy arrived, and Lou Harris, one of the finest newspaper men that I've ever known, was night city editor. We were working together on the night of the 21st, and Mike Quinn, a good friend of Griff Singer's, at that time a reporter at the News, who later had a distinguished career at the University of Texas, had talked to Lou and I the day before that night, and we had, and Mike said he could get us in the motorcade the next day. So when we left that night, the night editors generally got off about 1 o'clock unless something special was going on, then we stayed until 2. But we always stopped and had a cup of coffee or something. At that time, we stopped at the old Southern Hotel in downtown Dallas, had a cup of coffee, and finally I dropped Lou off at his house about, I guess about 2:15 or so. So we were going to get up early the next morning and meet Quinn and go on from there. So I got up the next morning in plenty of time to join him, but I decided, you know, I got to go to work this afternoon anyway. I'm just gonna. That was one of my poor choices. So I called Lou and told him I wasn't going to make it. So he went in, met Quinn, and Lou and Quinn drove in Lou's car out to Love Field. Lou was a canny newspaper guy, and somehow, as the motorcade left Love Field, Lou, who had no official business being in the motorcade, slipped his car in about the 5th car in the motorcade ahead of the press buses, and they were among the first cars, among the first newspaper people to get to Parkland Hospital. And Lou told me later that he wrote an account of all this for the Dallas News. I didn't see the News ever use it, but I thought it was a great story. He got one of the phones in Parkland Hospital, a pay phone, and one of the few phones that was left, and he was calling the desk. Griff said something about this, but at that, as I recall, almost everybody in the newsroom, the reporters were out on the sound, most of the editors were out at the Trademark. And Harvey Bogan, who had come in on his day off to spell, I think he owed Miller a day, or Miller promised him a day, was about the only editor in the newsroom at that time. So anyway, all this broke loose about that time, and Harvey was there almost by himself. So, anyway, I got interrupted myself there for a minute. But anyway, I was with my family at home. We were watching TV, waiting for having lunch and waiting for Kennedy to appear at the Trademark. And they reported shots had been fired, so I immediately dropped everything and took off for the news. And anyway, by this time, Lou Harris had gotten inside the Parkland Hospital, gotten the telephone, and he was calling the desk to give his story, give notes to Bogan or whoever was available there. And he said while he was talking, somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Give me the telephone." And Harris turned around and said, "Screw you," or something like that. And then he said the guy tapped him on the shoulder again, and he looked around and he saw a Secret Service badge. And so he handed him the phone, and the guy in turn handed the phone to a guy behind him and said, "Here's your telephone, Mr. Smith." and it was the guy he handed the phone to was Merriman Smith, the White House, chief White House correspondent for UPI. But fortunately, Lou wrote some other stories that day and got all his stories in. The thing I remember most, and Griff may remember this too, I guess the thing I remember the most about that day was Bob Baskin, who was our Washington bureau chief, was in such shock when he came in that he could hardly talk. So the editors gathered around him, and Baskin told his story to Paul Croom, and as Griff has already said, everyone deemed Croom the most brilliant writer on the paper at that time, and probably he was, but he took Baskin's notes from Baskin and wrote the lead story that day. Baskin later, I think he said he needed a little nip to get him back in shape. So, so they got him alive again, and he later wrote 2 or 3 stories that day. But anyway, that's my reminiscence of that day, for the most part. But I was telling Darwin on the way over, I was looking back at the paper of that period, and there was a kind of a little footnote to all this. On the same day that Kennedy was assassinated, there was a small obit way inside the paper about the death of Aldous Huxley, a brilliant British novelist who had written a book that most people are familiar with, Brave New World. So at any other time, Aldous Huxley's death would have rated a big story, but at that time it was only a footnote to the Kennedy story. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Don.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to all of you for your kind attention. Those are our stories, and we'll see you again in 50 years for the 100th.